and you guys should be able to see my screen at this point. Good, head nods. All right, well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon for this webinar. It's a little different than what, like some of you know that I've been doing some of the evening meetings, where this is actually kind of a joint effort between Bioworks and myself, because as many as you know, Bioworks has got some really good products. I do not work for Bioworks. They don't pay me kickbacks or anything like that. It's just, I think they've got good products, and they've been working really well with the cannabis industry. And I think there's been some, I don't want to say misunderstandings, but I don't think people necessarily know how to use the Suffoil to get the most out of it. And so that's why I thought this would be a good idea to do. And Julie and I have been talking about this. To talk about, you know, rates, how to apply it and things like that, because I did have somebody contact me and they accidentally applied Suffoil-X at a 10% spray rate the other night instead of the 1 to 2%. Amazingly, they only actually killed one plant. They burned the crap out of all the rest of the plants, but they did flush back out. You're not to spray at a 10% spray rate. If you ever have any questions about rates, if you're in question, it's always good to ask Bioworks, or Bioworks has a calculator right on their website you can use to help get rates if you need a mix of smaller batches. So for today, I am your main host. My name is Suzanne Wainwright Evans. For those of you that do not know me, I own Buglady Consulting, an insect consulting business that's been in business now 20 years. And I focus on biological controls, using pesticides correctly. I did go to school for this. I have degrees in entomology and environmental horticulture. And I know actually a lot of you are familiar faces, but if you do have any questions after the webinar, you can always reach out to me, or if it's very product specific, you might want to reach out to Julie, who is my co-host today, Julie Gresh, who lives in Iowa. She's a good friend of mine. We've been friends for a long time. And we've traveled to different places in the world together. And she has really cool hairless cats. That's my fun fact about Julie today. But she works for Bioworks, and she has a background. She has a, Julie, help me out. Your bachelor's is in
biology and animal ecology, and my master's is agriculture and entomology.
But you focused on Bavaria bassiana for your master's.
And my thesis was on Bavaria bassiana.
Yes, and you
and
have
two-spotted spider mites.
Oh, two-spotted spider mites. But don't think that you should be using Bavaria for two-spotted spider mite management. That's what's always scary about saying that. But Julie also has an extensive background working with beneficial nematodes and pesticide compatibility with beneficial nematodes. She's an excellent resource for that kind of information. So today, the way we figured we'd break it up is I'm going to start, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key pests in cannabis, not all of them. I'm just focusing on the ones that are mainly targeted by Suffoil, a little bit about their biology and some information for you. And then I'm going to hand it off to Julie, and then she's going to go through how to use the Suffoil product and get the most out of it. Type your questions in the question box, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. I always think that's one of the best parts of doing webinars and meetings, and then hopefully you'll get some useful information out of this. So we're going to first start by talking about some of the pests in cannabis. And I'm seeing a lot of interesting things. I actually was out last week, back at a first consulting job last week. I'm so excited to be out there and starting to work again. And get back out there. Sorry for the growers that have pest issues, but I'm excited to be out there seeing and working again. Now, in the pest category, first we're going to talk about mites. There are basically three groups of mites you need to be concerned with as a cannabis grower. Not to say down the road we might not find more, but for right now, these are the key ones. We have the spider mites, which contain the two-spot spider mite. We have the tarsinamid, which are the thread-footed mites, which contains the broad mite. And then we have the Areophyid. And don't get confused by the name that Areophytes are called Gall Mites, because the hemp russet mite is a gall mite, but it is not a gall forming one. Other Areophytes can cause gall, but hemp russets do not cause galls on the hemp plant. These three main mites here, the two-spotted spider mite, the hemp russet mite, and broad mite, so far are the main three that I've seen. We did, every once in a while, we see some oddball stuff around, but nothing that I would say is of huge economic importance. On this, I'm putting scientific names on there to make sure you guys start to recognize the scientific names more, because people use different common names for the same insect or mite and get confusing. And when you want to do literature searches and article searches, it's always best to use a scientific name to make sure you're talking about the same species there, because that's really important. So we're going to talk about spider mites, which are I will call it a cosmopolitan pest. It's a problem in ornamentals, vegetables, and cannabis. You can have this in your yard. It's been, this year it's raised its head a bit more. Spider mites have been a little quiet for a few years, but I've been getting contacted more about them this spring. And so it's something to definitely be aware of for this season. The damage they can do is, and this is extensive, but they do stippling on the leaves. Sometimes it possibly could be confused with some of the thrips damage out there on leaves, but often when you see this damage, you can look and either you can see the spider mites or you can see the thrips right on the plants. Now, spider mites feed different than insects a bit, because a lot of insects like your aphids have a straw-like mouth part that stick their mouth parts into the plant, and then they're sucking fluids out of more of like the vascular tissues. Spider mites are actually feeding on the cells, and that's why they're removing the chlorophyll out of the plant. And so that that's why you don't see systemic miticides, because of...
Rob, hit mute, please.
Oh, I'm going to do it for you, Chaz, because hold on, Chaz, I'm going to mute you because I can hear. Okay, there you go. Sorry. So this is why we don't really have systemic insecticides or miticides for mites, because the way that most systemic pesticides flow is inside more of the vascular tissue, and the mites aren't feeding on that part of the plant. So that's why we don't get enough active ingredient into that cell layer. But that's why translaminar miticides work, is because you spray them on the leaf and they're absorbed into those top cells. In cannabis, we don't have systemic or really any translaminar options in most states for legal facilities, but just be aware if somebody tries to tell you a systemic miticide, there's one exception out there in ornamentals, but it doesn't really apply to cannabis because you can't use it. But that's why we need contact products out there. Now, with identification, and this is where it can get a little tricky, that you can have different color variations on spider mites. I mean, everybody's used to seeing the creamy colored ones with the 2 spots on it, but we're actually seeing a lot more of these orange red, or we call it the red form of the 2-spot spider mite out there. We're seeing it across all crops. We don't know why, but I think sometimes this could be confusing to people. Also, when you're looking at them, you always want to count their legs, and if something has 8 legs, it's not an insect, it's definitely a mite, because mites have 8 legs and they won't have antenna and they won't fly. I think people sometimes get confused on the mites too, because the mites' front legs tend to stick out front, and they do a lot of this and they tap with their front legs, but people think those are antenna, and those are actually their legs that they're using. So here is your, as generic as they can come, 2-spot spider mites, the creamy colored with the 2 spots that can be very visibly seen. This is what we're seeing a bit more of. And this is not the world's best picture, but it's the one I found that kind of had the things in there I wanted to show you. If you look on the right, you can see half of a spider mite egg, so they're perfectly round. When they hatch, and they're what they call a protonymph, and they're very young, it's easy to see these 2-spot markings on them, even though it's blurry, you guys get what I'm saying. But what we're finding as they keep maturing into adults, they turn more of this reddish color. That is just a 2-spot spider mite sitting right there. But some people get them confused with southern red, carmine, Tetranicus tumetis, and other things like that. So sometimes when you're looking at these mites, look at the babies, and if you see that it's just a 2-spot, then you'll know that's what you have. Now, it's possible to have more than one mite species at a time, pretty uncommon, but just be aware that this red form is just a 2-spot spider mite, but we are seeing more of it through all cropping systems. So I went over the egg. It's perfectly round and smooth. We often find that the spider mites will lay their eggs in their webbing. So if you do find a webbing, you can search around in there. Now, when those eggs first hatch, the baby little mites will have 6 legs, but after they molt, then they'll have 8. And usually when they first hatch, they're so small, people aren't counting the legs on them right there anyhow. I wanted to show you this picture here. We're not talking about predatory mites today, but I just wanted to throw this in there. So it resting in my hand, which I found is a good way to point this out, that is actually a predatory mite egg. So if you are using predatory mites, it's important to get out there and scout and look and see the difference between predatory mite eggs and an egg just north of it. That is a 2-spot egg. And if you find 2-spot eggs with predatory mite eggs in there, I don't recommend spraying, because that predatory mite egg is going to hatch and then eventually start feeding on the 2 spots. So you have to learn to make sure you scout and see what's out there on the plants. If you just find a bunch of 2-spot eggs, you definitely need to treat. And what I often find is people just scout for adult spider mites and don't look for the eggs, because I found leaves with like 20 and 30 eggs on them of spider mites, and in about 2 to 3 days, it's going to be horrific. And it's important to spray right then to kill the eggs on there. Now, the other group of the thread-footed mites, the tarsinemids, this is where the broad mites fall into. Again, this particular species is what I consider cosmopolitan. It's in ornamentals, it's in vegetables, it's pretty common in New Guinea impatiens, it's common in peppers. I'm seeing it a lot less in cannabis, because I think cannabis growers know about it now, and so many are doing preventative programs with predatory mites, with things like cucumaris and Swirsky. It's stopping the problem from happening. These are very, very tiny mites, and often you see the damage, you don't actually see the mites. You're more likely to find the eggs. They have no antenna, no wings, and again, they're so tiny, it's going to be hard to even see their legs in there. The eggs is one of the key diagnostic things, and I'm going to show you a picture here in a minute on the plant. This is the kind of damage they do on a New Guinea impatient. I wanted to show you this because this is something that we've battled for years in ornamentals, and just a few mites can cause this kind of damage. In cannabis, it takes loads of them to actually see damage. Cannabis has a much higher tolerance for this pest than ornamental crops do. You still need to treat for it. And I do think people sometimes get confused the damage between broad mites and hemp russet mites, but if you just get in there and look, the mites look very different and are easy to tell apart on there. So now again, this is generally how you see the damage, and so you get in there and look, and what you want to look for is broad mite eggs, and they have these like dimples on them. They're much smaller than spider mite eggs, much smaller, but they're oval like predatory mite eggs, but they've got all those dots on them, and that's how we know that that's a broad mite in there. Because again, it can be hard to find the adults because they're often running around and can be in low numbers on there, but that's the key diagnostic thing on there. Now, the other group of mites, the gall mites, this is where the hemp russet mite falls in. And I think there's the confusion because it's called the gall mite. That's why people think they're living inside of the tissue. They're not. They sit exposed right out on the plant. You can see them right on the surface. They are not burrowing into the plant. They're not ovipositing their eggs into the plant. They're very small, and the key thing here is they're carrot shaped. Now, they also do have 2 pair of legs at the fatter end, but again, legs are going to be really hard to see because they're so small on the plant. But again, they've got this distinct carrot shape, and I've been working on slide mounting some of these, and they actually are quite jagged along the edge, but they're very easy to see once you know what you're looking for. And it's amazing to me how mobile and how fast they can actually move, but they are very reliant on humans to move them around and outside animals. But these are specific to hemp and cannabis. This does not live, as of yet, we know, on any other crop. They're very specific to this. So if you have them, somebody brought them in, or they came in on plant material, they came in on somebody's clothing on there on the crop. Now, a lot of people, if they have curling, immediately go to hemp russet mite. This curling here can be caused by hemp russet mite. I've also seen it happen in lighting trials. I've seen it with root disease issues. Cannabis does some weird curling when it's stressed. If you see this, I would definitely go in and look to see if you have hemp russet mite, but if you don't, make sure you check your roots, check everything else out, because it's giving you a signal that they're not happy about something. But don't assume this is hemp russet mite on the plant. The damage is also pretty obvious in the buds, because they can really get up in the buds, and it's amazing how they can move around in there, and they can really cause these distorted buds, which are, you know, sad, but this is what does end up happening. Now, on the insect side of things, we're going to briefly talk about aphids, thrips, and whiteflies. Aphids, which are one of my favorite insects to study and just watch and raise and have. They're basically just almost like bags of water that just stick their long straw-like mouth part into the plant, and they're perpetually sucking fluids out. Depending on species, depends on how hard they are to manage. You definitely want to get them early because they can reproduce quite quickly. In cannabis and hemp right now, and this is not all the species, but this is more of what I'm seeing out there. Definitely this year, cannabis aphid #1 on just sheer numbers. And then we're also seeing cotton melon and a little bit of the others, but it's mostly cannabis and cotton melon are the ones we're seeing out there. Now, to identify aphids, which is really important, again, if you know me, we go through ID over and over and over again. It's really important to look at things like the antenna. We look at the cotta, which is basically the bump on their butt, and then they have the corticals, the tailpipe. It's also really important to look what's called the tubercle. Oops, I need to do that. Tubercles between their antenna, because we use that a lot for identification. And so here you can see this is a cannabis aphid that I collected out in Oregon earlier this year, and you can see here this headspace here. This is the tubercles, and those projections there are one of the diagnostic tools to let me know that this is a cannabis aphid. So this is what I've been practicing and getting better at, is slide mounting these insects so I can see all the different anatomy, where the CD is located, which is basically the insect hair on them. And so ID of insects can be hard, but once you have a pest, you learn what it is, then you'll recognize it for the next time. Now, with aphids, a few things about them. Pretty much everything you guys are going to see are going to be females. They don't have to mate to reproduce, and that's why they can become an issue, because basically they just sit there and constantly have babies, and for the most part they skip the egg stage. There's an exception with the cannabis aphid in some situations, but for most people they skip the egg stage, so they have live birth, and so they're immediately able to feed when they come out. And the challenging thing about this too is basically they're clones of their mother, so we don't get genetic diversity. So that means if mom's resistant to a pesticide, that their offsprings are going to have that resistance too. And this is what has been very challenging in traditional ag to manage aphids, is because we do have a lot of pesticide resistance. There's actually databases online where you can look up what part of the world, what aphid species, and what they've been able to document the resistance to. in the cannabis industry, you guys are pretty limited on your products, and you don't have a ton that you can build resistance to, but definitely the pyrethrins, you can absolutely build resistance to them. And that's why a lot of people are looking to soaps and oils, because that's more of a mechanical kill, and your chances of building resistance to a soap and oil are, I never want to say it could never happen, but it's pretty slim it's ever gonna happen. And so that's why there's been a focus on soaps and oils for managing aphids. Another area that I've actually been contacted and seen a lot of this year are thrips. Numbers can sometimes, you know, get a little crazy. Normally don't see them super high in cannabis. We are seeing multiple multiple thrip species out there. From my experience, the most I'm seeing is onion thrips. And actually I've had a handful of people contact me that have echinothrips this year too. It's important to identify what species you have so we understand for management better. Identifying can be challenging. Again, I go through this a lot. Sarah Jendrisic up in Canada has a great grower's key that if you want to give a hand at trying to identify thrips, where she goes through all the anatomy and then explains the differences on, you know, where the seed is located. Western flower thrips, basically, you know, have these long hairs up on the equivalent of their shoulders, where they're missing on the onion thrips. So those are the kinds of things that we have to look at. And this is the web address if you are interested in finding that key, which I recommend just having it. But if you just Google like Sarah Jendrisic Canada thrips greenhouse key, you can easily find it instead of having to try to type that in to get it. Now with thrips, again, to really put a good program together, we need to know what species it is, because if you do have echinothrips, you're going to have to spray for them, because biocontrol agents don't work really for them because they don't pupate in the soil. Western flower thrips and onion thrips do pupate in the soil, but echinothrips does not. It pupates on the leaves. So things like nematodes aren't going to do you any good. Really, to manage them, you have to target them at multiple life stages, and that's why we do typically a combination of sprays with biocontrol agents so that we can target things like their eggs, their immatures, their pupa, and the adults. As far as potential for a virus vector, because in ornamentals and vegetables, this is a huge issue. The reality is in cannabis, we don't know enough yet. We don't know enough. I did see somebody, which I consider somewhat famous, hop on, Marjorie Daughtry. If you don't know her, she is an insanely good plant pathologist. And I'm really hoping at some point Cornell is going to allow her to do some virus work in hemp. I'm really hoping Marjorie can do that because she has such a good research background. And we need to understand more about virus issues in cannabis and who's vectoring it. Is it mechanical? Is it the thrips? We just don't have answers to a lot of this yet. So as far as whiteflies go, there's pockets of this around. I wouldn't be too concerned about it, but I have seen them in cannabis in Southeast United States and up in British Columbia. I've had growers have issues with them up there. There's basically two species we deal with. There's the greenhouse whitefly, which is the Trilobroides, and then there's the sweet potato whitefly, which is Bemisia. This is where literature and book learning is different than what's happening in reality, because if you look up literature and research papers about hemp, you see a lot of references to the greenhouse species, the Trilobroides. I've never seen Trilobroides in hemp or cannabis at this point. Everything I found has been Bemisia. So this is why working and being out in the field is so important, to really know really what's happening compared to what is in older papers, because insects can hop hosts. It happens. Ecologies change. The plants change on there. But whiteflies can easily also be managed through spray programs in conjunction with a predatory mite. So, but again, whiteflies aren't ones you have to worry too much about. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Julie, let me stop my, sorry, let me, stop share. I'm going to switch over and let Julie switch over, and then she's going to talk about, okay, Julie, you should be good to go now. to talk about use.
Alrighty, thank you, Suzanne. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Awesome. So first of all, I want to thank Suzanne Wainwright Evans for hosting this webinar. She, as she said earlier, she is an amazing friend of mine, and she was there the first day I started my career in biocontrol. My boss said, you need to talk to Suzanne Wainwright. And so she was there from my day one, and that was 14, 15 years ago. So Suzanne is an amazing reference and a great friend. So thank you again, Suzanne. So we're going to be talking about Suffoil-X and Cannabis. Of course, a lot of the recommendations and information that I'm going to give isn't necessarily always going to be specifically about cannabis. So if there's any ornamental growers on, it's going to apply to you as well. So Suffoil-X is available in both the United States and in Canada. So the packaging for Canada is there on the right. It is the salmon colored jug there. And it's the exact same formulation. But there are some differences in labeling, and we will go through that. But Suffoil-X is a horticultural mineral oil that is a broad spectrum suffocant of insects, mites, and powdery mildew. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to start with some product information. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how it works and why it's different from some other competitive oils. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the cannabis program, which should hopefully be mostly a review from the first parts of the presentation. So some product information here. Suffoil-X is an 80% narrow range mineral oil, and the other 20% is water and emulsifiers. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but I wanted to mention it here because it is an important and an important differentiator. So this is, like I said, a broad spectrum suffocant oil, which is the mode of action, MOA. And this is my only comment to what insects and mites are controlled. So thank you, Suzanne, for the first part of this presentation and covering all of these insects and mites. So once again, mites, scales, thrips, aphids, whiteflies, powdery mildew are all on the label. This has a 2-year shelf life at room temperature. And here's one of those differences in labeling. US has a 4-hour REI and a 0 PHI, whereas Canada has a 12-hour REI and a PHI. Once again, this is exactly the same thing in Canada and the US, but different regulatory bodies see things differently, and so they, PMRA usually is a little bit more strict. So that's why you see the difference, and make sure that you use the correct label depending on what country you're in. Something really exciting is in the last month or so, we got a brand new Suffoil label in Canada. Once again, this is in Canada, for cannabis. So cannabis is actually on the Suffoil label in Canada. There's also an ornamental dip recommendation in Canada. Again, it's not specifically for cannabis, so it's just listed, the dip is just listed at this point for ornamentals. However, we do hope to change that as we gain more experience and get more data on this product in cannabis and hemp. So I just want to go over a few application instructions. So you want to apply at the first sign of insects and disease, and the disease here we're mostly targeting is powdery mildew. It's right on the surface of the plant. Your rates, and the rates are the same, it's just metric versus imperial. So the US is 1 to 2 gallons per 100 gallons, and Canada is 10 to 20 liters per 1,000 liters, and that is a 1 to 2% solution. This, by the way, for those people who are ornamental growers that are going to do the dip, it is a 0.1. So don't use the same dipping ratio for the spray rate. So once again, specific to the people who are on from Canada, once again, PMRA is a little bit more stringent, so they wanted 6 applications from cutting to harvest. 14-day reapplication interval. And once again, as I said a minute ago, it's only registered for spray at this time, but hopefully we do get the dip in the near future for cannabis. When you are applying to the budding or flowering stage, please make sure that you use the low rate, which is the 1% rate. And that recommendation is based on the trichomes. We just don't want, those are a little bit more susceptible, and so we don't want you to hurt those. So use only the low rate during flowering. Coverage is absolutely critical for any contact insecticide, which that's what this is. So incorrect timing and poor coverage are primary causes for biopesticide failure. You want to make sure you get full coverage, especially on the underside of the leaves and the stems, where most of your insects like thrips, aphids, whiteflies, mites are going to be hiding. You want to use a directed spray. So if you just do overhead irrigation, that's not going to cut it. You're only going to get the stuff on the top, which might be okay if you're going after powdery mildew, but not so much if you're going after insects. So you need a directed spray, like some of the pictures that I have here. You want to use a nozzle that delivers a fine droplet size. And the reason for that is it's going to get better coverage. You want to spray to glisten. It's going to penetrate the canopy better, and it's going to be able to better coat the plant surface and subsequently the insects and the mites. My soapbox for the day is don't use paint sprayers. And if you've ever heard Suzanne talk about cannabis, you'll have heard her say this as well. The reason for that recommendation is that you don't get as good a coverage with in these organizations, especially if you have a large area to treat. It just doesn't have the projection. It's not designed for these types of situations. And you can also have some heavy metals coming off the tanks in certain situations. My last soapbox item here is that if you use a company like DRAM, there's other companies too, they can help you with any equipment issues that you have. They'll help you with calibration. They're a great company. So there's a lot of benefits to using proper equipment. I'm off my soapbox now. You don't want to fog this product. And once again, fogging is usually ultra low volume, which means you're not using very much water. And when you don't use very much water and you're putting your normal rate of oil in there, you're not going to be at 1 to 2% anymore, and that instantly becomes a herbicide. So don't fog Suffoil, or most oils I don't think can be fogged. So don't fog Suffoil. Here is an example of cannabis that has been sprayed by Suffoil. So you can see at 1% there and 2%, you do get a little bit of a residue. It's a shiny residue, and it's not harmful to the plant, and it does go away with time and overhead irrigation. But I do want you, I put this picture in here so that you are aware that it does leave a little bit of a residue on the plant. Some use precautions here is you want to make sure that when you apply this product, you do it when relative humidity is below 90% and apply before temperatures are 33 degrees Celsius or 91 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason for that is you want to make sure that this product dries within 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours after application. So things that you can do here is you want to turn off lights and turn on your horizontal airflow fans, and that's going to increase the drying capability in your operation. So it's an important part of getting the product dry once applied. You also do not want to apply to drought-stressed plants. And the reason for that is when you apply it when you apply oils to a drought stressed plant, that plant is hungry for water and it will suck up anything that you apply to it. And if you do that, it's just going to suck the oil into the tissue and you can have a special kind of phytotoxicity. So make sure that you apply water and all your leaves are very turgid and your plant is happy before applying Suffoil. So I'll do that. I want to touch on compatibility because compatibility is very important. For compatibility with insecticides, there's no major concerns. However, you do want to make sure that you look at other chemical labels that you're using and make sure that those chemical labels do not recommend not using oils. So sometimes you have that with certain products. So make sure you know your labels. Also, if you're using other EC or ES products, those are also oil-based. And if you combine Suffoil with some of these other oil products, you're just increasing your oil load and you could have phytotoxicity. So it's better to apply oils separately rather than combine them, just to prevent phytotoxicity. With compatibility, the only major fungicide that's not compatible is sulfur. And if you're applying a wet sulfur, that you don't want to apply Suffoil for 2 to 3 weeks. And that really just depends on how long that sulfur is active. And sometimes it can be active for longer than that. And Marjorie probably has a little bit more information on that than I do, but it does react negatively when you apply a sulfur product. The burned sulfur is it's active less for a shorter period of time, but you do still need to have a little bit of an application window. It's also not sulfur is also not very good for biocontrol agents, so that will also kill BCAs, and probably not very good for humans either. As far as compatibility with disinfectants, things like Purpose Plus, which is a BioWorks product that just has, it's just hydrogen peroxide, and it is compatible to tank mix with Purpose Plus and Xerotol, but not compatible to tank mix with Uptake or Clean Grow. Finally, to the BCAs, which is the really important part, this will harm BCAs. So if you directly contact Suffoil with your BCAs, it's going to kill it. The good thing is that as soon as it's dry, it's going to be safe. And really, as soon as you spray it, it's going to be safe, because then BCAs can sort of avoid until it's dry. And so things you can do here is you can spot spray. This is especially good if you're targeting mite populations that haven't completely spread throughout the entire organization. You can, and then you can re-release your predators or parasitoids after an application of Suffoil. So that's just one way that, a couple of ways that you can apply these two in conjunction for better management of insects and mites. So now I'm going to quickly go over exactly how Suffoil-X works. So here we have a 2% solution of, just want to make sure, okay. A 2% solution of Suffoil, which is on the right, and a competitive horticultural mineral oil, which is the HMO on the left. So with Suffoil, the other difference is you can see I also have a comparison between Suffoil, which is on the right, the product, which is a white, milky sort of yogurt substance versus the horticultural mineral, the competitive one, which is a clear amber liquid. And one of the main benefits to using Suffoil over a competitive horticultural mineral oil is that we have pre-emulsified the formulation so that we have broken down the oil particle size. And you can see this in this 2% solution, that we have a very uniform oil particle size. And the benefits that you get from having this really tiny, it's like the size of a human skin cell, oil particle size, the benefit, one, is that larger oil droplet sizes are going to rise to the surface of a spray tank a lot faster. So the grower has to actually break down the oil in their spray tank. And the smaller the oil size, the better. So those larger droplets are going to rise to the surface a lot faster. And so if you don't have adequate circulation, you may be applying more of the water at the beginning and more oil at the end. So you could have a phytotoxicity concern there. So Suffoil will stay in solution a lot longer. I'm not saying it's not going to settle out. I'm just saying it's going to stay in solution for a lot longer than if you have to break the oil down yourself. The other benefit is when you have a small particle size, when you spray it out, these small oil particles will penetrate a canopy a lot more readily and suffocate insects by getting into those really small spiracles on the insect, the breathing tubes of the insect, more efficiently. So just a visual representation here of leaves, again, Suffoil on top and the competitive product down below. So here we have a spray application where you want, again, the product to dry within 1 to 2 hours. That product then kills the insects, and like you saw in the picture, will leave a very, very thin layer of oil on the plant. And that thin oil will not impede respiration or transpiration when applied properly. However, if you're using a heavier oil, and there are a wide variety of oils out there on the market with different densities. So if you're using a heavier oil that has larger droplet sizes in your water, you could have a thicker layer of oil on your plant, and that could cause some problems and cause phytotoxicity. So my last comment here about phytotoxicity is that, once again, this product smothers typically without phytotoxicity, as long as you're doing all the things that we've previously talked about. However, not all varieties have been tested, so it's always important when using a new product on a new plant or variety to always test on a small scale before going full scale. You also want to make sure that you know the difference between phytotoxicity and disease and phytotoxicity and nutritional issues, because they can sometimes look similar. So in the pictures off to the right, the top picture is a poinsettia leaf, and this grower didn't realize that you couldn't fog, and she fogged Suffoil. So that's the sort of damage that you would get in a poinsettia crop with fogging of Suffoil. Down below is strawberry, and there are two types of damage here. The leaves on the top here is phytotoxicity, and the leaf below is a disease. And you can see that it's disease because there's tiny little black specks. And if you turn the leaf over, you might also see some more of the disease signs and symptoms. So it's really important, and then nutritional issues can also exhibit some of those disease issues. So here you're wanting to pop the plant out of the pot if you can, and look at those root systems. Are they nice and white, or are they brown and ugly? There's also a lot of other things that you can look at with disease, but really sometimes it takes a little bit of practice. Sometimes it takes help. Sometimes it takes sending plant tissue samples to be analyzed to confirm either the sort of disease that you have or if you're dealing with a nutritional issue. So I just have one slide on competitive oils, and this is just really to tell you sort of the main differentiator for Suffoil versus a lot of these other competitive oils. So, and here we have a couple of products for both Canada and the US. So Veg All insecticide oil, that's a 96% canola oil. And I have heard that there is some phytotoxicity that growers have had with this product, specifically in cannabis. Pure Spray Green is a 98% mineral oil. JMS stylet oil is a 97.1%, and ultra pure oil is a 98%. And if you remember from one of my first slides, Suffoil is 80%. So that pre-emulsification gives you several different benefits that I've talked about, but it's a little bit easier on the plant, so you have less phytotoxicity. It stays in solution better, better penetration into the canopy, better penetration into those insect spiracles. So there's a lot of benefits to this pre-emulsification. So this is a very unique product on the market. So now we get to the final part of my presentation. I'm talking a little bit more about the program specifically for cannabis. So in seeding, rooting, or vegetative growth, you want to apply Suffoil to the mother plants or crop at first signs of insects and disease. And these recommendations do change a little bit depending on if you are using BCAs. It gets a little bit more, it can be more complicated, but the main thing is if the insect populations are getting too numerous for your biological control agents or natural enemies to be keeping up, it might be a point where you would want to bring in some of these oils, soaps, or other compatible products to bring the population down. So Suffoil, again, it would be used as a knockdown. Once again, you want to spray to full coverage, basically to glisten. If you apply to runoff, that runoff is going to go into the soil, and you don't want to have oils in your soils. So spray to glisten, make sure you get on the underside of the leaf and on the stems, especially for mites. Beneficial insects and mites, so if you're using the sachet products, the mites that are still in those sachets will not be harmed. So those are going to continue to come out of the sachets, and those should be continuing to go on the plant and find prey. Anything on the plant, any mites on the plant that you directly hit will be killed. Parasitized aphids. The wasp that is in the aphid mummy would not be harmed. Then they would still be able to come out and go about their parasitism. However, any adults that you have would be killed if you directly sprayed them with Suffoil. So then for the flowering, you want to use caution. Anytime you're applying to any flowering plant, you want to use caution. So first of all, don't exceed that 1%. And once again, test on a small scale to make sure that it's not going to harm the plant. Again, use the fine droplet size so you get a nice thin layer on the plant. Turn off lights, have fans running so it can dry within that 2-hour time frame. And our recommendation is to suspend 1 week prior to harvest. Even though, if you remember from one of our first slides, you can apply in the United States the day of harvest, or in Canada the day before harvest, 12 hours before. Our recommendation here 1 week prior to harvest is just based on it does leave a residue. The residue is not harmful, and it dissipates over time, and it typically comes off during the harvest process, so it's not a concern, but it's always better to apply fewer things as you get closer to harvest. But if you absolutely have no other choice, it's still a good option since it's non-toxic. So the last few slides, I just wanted to tell you that we have a guide both for the US and Canada, and this basically just the difference in what products are available. And we would be happy to send you these guides. They're also available on our website. But this shows you our insect control products, it gives you several different rates that you can use. So if you're smaller, it will give you the smaller, if we look at Suffoil, so 37 mils per 1 gallon instead of the larger rates. So it's just a really nice guide that puts all of our recommendations in one place. I want to also tell all of the Canada growers that we have hot off the press late last week. We officially have a Canada emergency label for Botanigard 22 WP.
I'm so excited. I can't contain my excitement. So yay. All you Canada people, lean in and look. Melissa, you're leaning in hard. I can see you.
So specifically for the rice root aphid in cannabis. So this label is out there, and you can now purchase this for, so if you know an emergency use label is only good for 1 year. However, during this 1 year, we are going to generate as much data as we possibly can so that at the end of that 1 year, we can get that actually put onto our final label and have it always be there. So we're super excited about it. So I wanted to, I know it's Botanigard, I know it's not Suffoil, but I had to let everybody know. So just a few more things. There's also, in that same guide, there's also disease control options. Once again, the difference between US and Canada is just how many products we were able to get registered in Canada, and again, plant nutrition. So we also have a line of plant nutrition products that are fantastic. A lot of our products are OMRI or WSDA certified, so I have our products that are listed for both the US and approved for use in organic production in Canada. And once again, Suffoil is listed on both of those as OMRI listed in the US and approved for use in certified organic production in Canada. So I'm going to kick off the question section with a couple of common questions. So the first common question is, will Suffoil clog my plant stomata or breathing tubes? And the answer, hopefully I answered that, but if you apply the product at the label rates, so 1 to 2%, applied through proper spray equipment, so no paint sprayers and no fogging, and under the correct environmental conditions, so heat and moisture, it should not inhibit respiration and transpiration of the plant. So it should not cause phytotoxicity. The second common question that I get is, how much sulfur is in Suffoil? And the reason I get that question is if you look at many of, and it's not just the case for Suffoil, but many oils will have in addition to how concentrated the oil is in the formulation, so 80%, 98%, they often will give a percent of unsulfonated residue. And what that means, unsulfonated residue does not mean the amount of sulfur. It means it's a degree of refinement of the oil, and it's an indication of the amount of phytotoxic materials remaining after refinement of the oil. So you want to have an oil that is greater than 92% or greater, which means that it's more pure and less phytotoxic, and anything 91% and below is less pure and could potentially be more phytotoxic. So that's the main difference there in helping you understand what that means. So with that, I would like to kick off at any additional questions that we have. And this is Suzanne and I with Kilted Gentlemen in Scotland. So with that, what questions do you have?